Hey, Whiskey Ringers, welcome to a brand new intro. First off, there are still a few bottles of our single barrel rye finished in Armagnac casks, picked in partnership with This Is My Bourbon podcast. Check out the show notes for links to purchase. Second, I am thrilled to announce that I've joined the Bar Cart Co-op. This group of podcasts and shows has a show or multiple for everyone. I'll talk more about them in the mid-roll. Finally, there are still two $25 spots available on Patreon. These are the last two spots that will ever be open on that tier, so if you've been putting it off, grab your spot today. There are also spots available at the $15 a month level if you want to support but can't quite commit to that $25 tier just yet. There's a spot in supporting for everyone's budget, and I truly thank you all for making this podcast possible. Hey, Whiskey Ringers, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Jason from Copperworks Distilling up in Washington State. Jason, welcome on.
Thank you. Happy to be here, David.
Awesome. So we've got a lot of questions here, 4 releases to try through. Hopefully we'll get to all of them during the episode. And before we jump into the questions, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Nora and Adam at Lost Lantern, through whom I first became acquainted with Copperworks. That was your release in the sloe gin casks.
Oh, very fine. Oh, that was great. Good. I'm glad you discovered us that way. Yeah, they've been wonderful partners.
Absolutely loved it. So we'll jump right in. I wanted to start, as we do, with the origin story. And when did the distillery idea come to you?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I was raised in Kentucky, so you can imagine that you can take the origin all the way back to my childhood. But in reality, it came when I was in Seattle, having been a brewer, a professional brewer for many years, started as the first brewer at Pike Brewing in 1989. So I've always been making beer. When it became legal in Washington to do distilled spirits, that was June 2008, Dry Fly Distilling got a law passed that allowed craft distilling. That wakened me up to the fact that there was a opportunity, just like we had 25 years before when we had opened up Pike Brewing. At the time, there were just under 200 breweries in America, and there's now over 10,000. So I knew what the pathway was going to be like, and I was very interested in getting into the distilling world early, with the goal of making a quality beer with no hops, and then putting that into the stills and capturing the alcohol, maturing that into whiskey, and also making vodka and gin the same way. That felt like the right time to get in. And so we actually incorporated in 2011. So it was 3 years after the law passed, but it took us that long to really settle out. And that was with my good friend, Micah Nutt. Micah and I had been home brewers, living in a house together for many years. I had become a professional brewer, and he and I were still brewing together. So it made sense to join our forces and open up a distillery with the idea of starting as a beer.
And pardon me. So you mentioned Dry Fly, and so you also went to their school, if you will, to learn. And
yeah,
I'm curious.
It was interesting because that like you said, I at that time I anticipated it being more of a school, but it was actually more of you could call it an internship or an apprenticeship, or you could just call it a site visit. And that was actually exactly what I wanted. So after all of those years of being a brewer, I knew how hard it was. I knew how heavy kegs are, about 175-pound hoses, 2-inch diameter hoses that are 25 feet long or 150 pounds dragging on the floor. Everything is heavy, everything is tiring, and you're always on your feet. You're covered in water constantly. I wanted to see if distilling was that hard. So I just decided to pay them some money to show up and hang out. And they said, you can ask any question, you can take any photo, we will tell you everything we know. And they did. And what I discovered is, damn, distilling is a lot easier than brewing. I mean, it is just so much more fun. It's a lot of sitting around and filing taxes, which isn't fun. I'm going to be honest with you about that point. But it is the life cycle of making a whiskey is measured in years, whereas the life cycle of making a beer is weeks. So, you just have a lot less physical effort to do.
When besides Dry Fly being nearby in Seattle, in Washington, where else did you either visit and or look to for inspiration on how you wanted to create this distillery?
Right. So let's drop back just a little bit to ask the question about how you learn in general about doing distilling. In those days, there were no schools that were teaching distilling other than, say, here at Watt University and in Scotland. There was nothing in America that was teaching that. There was a few books that were being published by White Mule Press. That's American Distilling Institute's press. Most of them were for hobbyist home distillers. So the resources that a home brewer, a home winemaker, a home cider maker has were not in existence. And what I learned is that when you ask a distiller, say a Scotch distiller, a Kentucky distiller, how they do what they do, they're incredibly transparent. They tell you times, temperatures, processes, everything they know, they're happy to tell you. First of all, they're delighted that somebody has that level of interest. And second of all, they're not worried you're going to come and beat them at their own game. They've been doing it for hundreds of years. But if you ask them why they do what they do, they don't have a good answer. Their answer is simply, this is the way we've always done. This is our process. We don't deviate from our process. If we did deviate from our process, our products would no longer taste like they taste. And this is what we're famous for. So we're a little bit stuck in the traditional products having to be made in traditional methods to taste like they always have. We told everybody, so I'm getting to your answer in just a second. I visited Scotland in order to pick out the stills that we wanted. We went to Scotland because we knew that Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey, and Japanese whiskey, which was the type of whiskey we wanted to make from a alembic pot, a single alembic pot distillation, was the type of stills we wanted. We didn't want bourbon stills, which is Vendome is famous for that in Kentucky, and I really wanted to buy local, but we decided to go to Scotland to get our stills made. While over there, Richard Forsyth, Sr., the patriarch of Forsyth's Stills, introduced us, Micah and I, to about 10 different plant managers in Speyside. So we had the chance to go to Balvenie and Glenmorangie and Glenfiddich and Strathyla and all sorts of beautiful Adelauer, all sorts of beautiful distilleries that were within, a 20-mile drive or 20-kilometer drive as it was from Rothes, which is where the stills were being made. And we visited distilleries and they all told us the same thing. You can't make whiskey from beer. You have to make a wash. You have to make it the way we do it, or it won't taste like this. And that was not only refreshing to hear, because we knew we weren't going to make what they were making, but it was almost like a challenge. We said, but what would happen if you did boil the wash? And what would happen if you treated grain like grapes and you didn't ferment to end fermentation, you didn't have bacteria and wild yeast? We asked all these questions and their answer was always the same. It wouldn't taste like whiskey. And so that was what we decided to do. We wanted to make a whiskey that didn't taste like Scotch, Irish, or Japanese, and so focus on those processes. So the way we had to learn, finally to your question, the way we had to learn was by asking ourselves the question, I wonder why they ever started doing things this way. Why they ever start making a wash without boiling, when brewers always boil ever since Louis Pasteur. And the answer was always back to the same thing. Well, that's the way they always did it. It was just simply tradition. It got grandfathered into the next generation. They got trained from their parents and grandparents, and it's the way it's done. It makes delicious product, but it's not the only way to make product. So we had to learn from our own experiments what would happen if you made a beer and you didn't put hops in it, but then you finished it in a still and aged it in oak. And that's where we've been ever since. And I have to say, we're still learning and still experimenting. But it's been one of the great pleasures is to be forging down a slightly different pathway than what's now the traditional pathway. So now there's education out there. But back in the days when we started, there wasn't.
Just curious on this purely hypothetical, so we probably won't ever know the answer. But do you think the reason that these distillers, really all distillers, don't boil their beer, their wash, their wort, it just comes down to back in the days they may not have been willing to spend the energy cost on it to boil?
Absolutely, but they would have been willing to spend the energy cost if they thought that doing so would do what? Make them more money, make them more, well, ultimately the answer is make them more money. It might have made them more money by saving something and making it last longer. It might have made them more money by tasting better and beating out the competition. It might have made them more money for a myriad of reasons. But in fact, again, before Louis Pasteur discovered that yeast does fermentation and bacteria spoils wash, and that heating kills bacteria and allows you to pitch a pure strain of yeast in and therefore control that fermentation in a sanitary environment. Before then, nobody boiled. Brewers didn't boil, distillers didn't boil. It was not a known thing. So you get back to the question of profitability. Yes, it cost wood, coal, or coke, whatever you were using to generate the heat. That was part of the problem, but the other part of the problem was yield goes down because, and here we get into a little bit of science, in fermentation, well, I'm going to even back up. In mashing, you are converting carbohydrates into small fermentable sugars. If you allow the enzymes that are native in the husk of the grain to continue to reside in that wort, and you put all of that wort in a fermenter and you pitch yeast, those enzymes are still helping break down carbohydrates into small fermentable sugars. So in fermentation, you have a continuation of an enzymatic breakdown. But when you boil, you denature those enzymes. They're now ruined for any continued degradation of starches. So that means, just like in all beers, once you boil, yes, you sanitize. You also concentrate, so you're driving off water and getting a higher gravity start. And that's going to become important in a minute when we talk about flavors. But the third thing is you denature enzymes. Beer doesn't want to be bone dry. When you buy a bottle or a can of beer or a pint of beer, you expect it to have mouthfeel, texture, and some sweetness. And that residual sweetness could have been turned into fermentable sugar and a higher alcohol yield. And that's what traditional distillers were looking for. The maximum amount of yield from that pound of grain or pound of grapes that they had laying around. They wanted to get ultimate yield, and boiling reduced that. Flavor wasn't a driving force. Flavor was the secondary thing. And as a matter of fact, you might even say non-existent decision maker for a long time in whiskey. It was simply, is it alcoholic, and how much can I get from the acre of grain that I'm growing? So yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, and there's several nails that all go to the same thing, the economics of it.
Makes sense. So before we go to the next question, I do want to just say, as I said, we've got 4 samples to taste from here, 4 releases from you. And before I ask the next question, I'd love to break into one of them. So we've got the Craft Malt 22 Baroness, the release 34 peated Copeland, release 49 the Fritz Pale, and the release 50 Fritz Vienna. Which would you recommend starting with?
Let's start with the Fritz Pale. That's release 49. It has not been released to the general public yet, but I want to tell you a little bit about it.
Mhm.
So I'm going to dive down into a little rabbit hole again, which I'm apt to do every time I answer any simple question. I'll make it a boil the ocean. So bear with me on this.
If we don't get to every question, it just means you'll have to come back on. It's completely fine with me.
When you make a beer, you also add hops. Hops are delicious and they obfuscate most of the flavors of the malt, unless it's a very high kiln roasted malt or specialty malt that has particular flavors in it. But pale malt, which is called base malt for most beer, doesn't get a chance to shine over the hops.
Mhm.
So one of the wonderful things about whiskey is there's no hops, so you can focus just on the barley, yeast, and barrel. When we decided to treat grain like grapes, our goal was to look at varieties of barley, the farms that they came from. Are they on the east side or the west side of the Cascades? What type of irrigation or non? We try to do all non-irrigated when possible. And then what's the vintage? What year did it get harvested? And what was it grown on a field that had before? Was it a bunch of tulip bulbs? Was it potatoes? Was it a vetch? So we're learning about terroir of barley and treating that with the same respect that you would treat a variety of grape when you're making a wine, and what terroir that was influenced by. So this is a variety that was designed by Washington State University with a cross of a couple of different barleys. And it takes about 10 years to get a new barley variety out. And that variety was originally named NZ151. It later became named Richard, but unfortunately everybody called it Dick. They didn't like that, so they changed it to Fritz. And so that is Fritz that we had, like most base malt, kilned at a very low color, a very low heat. And that doesn't develop as much flavors, but it does preserve all the enzymes. So that's the pale malt that you're drinking now, 100% pale malt Fritz barley out of Skagit Valley, Washington.
Right off the
What do you
nose,
get out of
yeah, as soon as I opened it and poured it into the glass, it was not a tight nose. Let's put it that way. The flavors flowed out. I wouldn't say the first flavors were beer related. At least this is the way that I think about them. I'm obviously more of a whiskey drinker than a beer drinker, but so that's where my flavor wheel kind of goes. A lot of caramel, honeyed, lighter caramel. We're not talking like toffee kind of
Yeah,
levels, but a lighter caramel just turning in the pan, spiked with a little bit of maltiness. I know it's a really broad term, but the way that I mean that, I think, is it's not a grainy malt. It's the sense that this is from a malt. You can taste the malt flavor without thinking that this is basically new make or barley eau de vie, if you will.
right, right.
And I think the other part, as I taste it and kind of let it roll around, it's not oaky. It's really about the prickliness of the alcohol as it's hitting the different parts of the mouth and the fullness of the flavor and mouthfeel as it rolls around. And I think
And tell me a little bit about the finish.
it's very long. The finish does tend to more of what I think of as an ale type beer. A little bit of bitterness on there, which frankly I like. I tend towards IPAs and really hoppy things when I drink a beer, so that's definitely my wheelhouse. I think as is kind of expected, it the barley remains the thread throughout the finish, which follows from mid palate down throat. And like I said, it's still going. This is several minutes after I've tried it. It's still going. It's still laying there in a layer. So you can just tell there's more to it. And
That's thank you for the great descriptions, because I'm unfortunately without my own sample here, but let me tell you a little bit about how that happens. When Scotch, Irish, Japanese malt whiskey is made, the fermentation goes to almost bone dry. So basically all fermentable sugars are converted into alcohol. So what that leaves is a great amount of alcohol that you can capture the right cuts. You can put them into barrels and mature them, but you're left with very, very little residual sugar, and that is coats the mouth. That sugar brings forward, like it does in a beer, that sugar brings forward maltodextrose, maltotriose, things that taste like barley, that taste like barley malt. And those flavors are missing in most traditional malt whiskeys. And that's because they've been converted into alcohol. The nice thing about starting with the quality beer is that we leave a considerable amount of unfermented sugar. Let's talk about gravities for a minute. You mentioned that earlier before we were online. We do a 1074 starting gravity, so about an 18 Plato starting gravity, but we end between 10.9 and 1013. So there's a lot of unfermented sugar in there, right? That's unheard of. First of all, the fact that we're starting at 18 Plato or 1074 is really weird because you can't get that without boiling. You have to drive off water, or else you're making, a kind of a barley wine and wasting way too much sugar. So we do higher gravity ferments. What are higher gravity ferments famous for? Fruit notes, floral notes, mouthfeel and texture. Next thing, we don't end ferment past what the yeast naturally goes to, and we don't convert all of those sugars. And that boiling of the wash, which we boil for about an hour to drive off water and get that high gravity, done a complete sanitation, leaves all those complex sugars unconverted, and they actually make it through the still. I didn't know they were going to do this. Nobody had ever told me that if you don't ferment to the end, you might get some flavor out. This was experimentation. And what happened is that creates texture. What do you get to do when you have mouthfeel? It coats your mouth. You get to bring the alcohol volume up in the bottling. So we don't bottle at 80 or 84 or 90 or 92. We bottle at 100 proof, 50% alcohol. Normally 50% is too hot. In a bourbon, it burns. In a Scotch, it can really burn. This does not tend to burn, but it does leave a long finish. So we get two things that you don't normally get. We get mouthfeel, texture, and coating of the mouth, and therefore a long finish. Like you said, it goes on for minutes instead of on for seconds. And that's been one of the other delights about starting with a beer, is that we get to have these long finishes. And for me, that's probably the biggest joy of Copperworks, is those fruit notes that develop late into everything from melon rind to, bark and, cigar wrapper and these sorts of things that are like really interesting compounds start showing up late.
I mean, I'll be honest, when I was doing the research for this episode and I first heard you mention a 1074 specific gravity for this, I honestly thought that I had made a typo in my notes. It's incredibly high. It's way beyond what you normally get at a distillery, for sure. And then you confirmed it during the Drammers event back in October, and I was like, oh, crap, it's actually a 1074. The Plato scale I'm less familiar with. Brix might be more.
It's about
people might have heard of the Brix scale.
Yeah.
All ways to measure specific gravity, the amount of sugars and the density of the liquid compared to water. Something that became clear through all of the research and even what you've said already, if it's not clear already, it should be, is that you put an immense amount of care and attention to the barley itself. Not surprising, given your background. You were a brewer for 20 plus years before Copperworks even started. But even so, above and beyond what and almost any other distillery is doing, especially those who are using barley exclusively. So they're really focusing just on that one grain. So to this end, you've been doing, in many ways, a deep dive into the varieties of barley that can grow best in Washington, including what makes a good Washington whiskey. You could have a variety that doesn't grow well but does make a good Washington whiskey, or vice versa, including some local peated product, which we'll talk about a little later. So my first question on that is, have you gotten comparisons to the Waterford distillery in Ireland?
We have been compared to the philosophy of Mark Renier, but we have not been compared in flavors to the products he's producing. So what's wonderful about Mark's vision is that it has the same aesthetic that we do. We're chasing a philosophy of flavor, which is rare right now, but I'm hoping will become common. And that is getting all the way back to, what does this neighborhood produce best? It doesn't have to be that only that neighborhood can produce it, but oftentimes it will be. So terroir is a often used and sometimes misused term. It doesn't just mean things like the minerality of the soil or how much rainfall it gets and on average, or even what the sun cycles are like. It also means what's the biosphere, what other plants are growing there that are interacting, what's the organisms and the bugs and the disease, what are the tools and techniques that are standard to that locale, what type of plows do they use, or do they plow? And all of these things lead to a traditional flavor, or they lead to a flavor, whether they're traditional or not. And that's kind of what we're exploring. It's a big data problem. There's absolutely no way for us to say that everything that you taste came specifically because of that variety of malt. It doesn't. It might also come because of the equipment they use, the malt house, all the conditions of the malt house, all the fermentation. Guess what? Yeast. Yeast is where flavor comes from. And we're trying to only use one variety of yeast. I say trying, because we'll get to this a little bit later. We've actually been experimenting with about 10 different varieties specific just for an experimentation. But what most of our product releases for the past 11 years have come out as one variety of yeast, one strain of yeast. And that's not because we don't believe that yeast is an incredible contributor, but we're trying to, we love the flavors, and we're trying to be purposeful about exploring some of the details of the variety of barley and where it came from. So that said, I think our exploration is just starting. And, I just wish I'd be around for another 100 years, because I really believe that as brewers become distillers and they take that philosophy of malt forward all the way through to the whiskeys that we'll be making, it's just going to be so interesting to see how America divides in these areas of flavor. The Pacific Northwest, east of the Cascades, so dry farming, will have a different variety that works best there with temperatures and times and everything else than the west of the Cascades, where it rains hard. Well, who knows what's going to be coming out of the rest of America? And sometimes barley isn't going to be the product that's best. Other times it'll be fine. So this is exciting. This is like being on the cusp of discovering that wine has varieties of flavor, and they can be attributed to the grapes and where they grow and how they grow.
And just before we get into the unique process, much of you actually already kind of covered a lot of it, but I want to focus on a couple of things. I wanted to call back to a line that you used in, I think this was your first One Nation Under Whiskey interview. And it was saying that the word craft has a significantly different connotation with beer than it does with whiskey. And so was from back in 2018. And to what you were just saying, it immediately made me think of, as I said, I'm an IPA guy when I drink a beer. I prefer West Coast IPAs I like East Coast IPAs, but I prefer the West. I know plenty of people who like porters and stouts and these dessert stouts that are blowing up everywhere. Some people like more of a alpine or high in Colorado kind of style. And today, as a consumer at least, I kind of take these regionalities for granted. That these are different flavors. Yes, I can taste them. Yes, I have a preference, but they all have a place. And to your point, I think that's 20, 30, even 40 years going back to the origin of craft brewing movement. Now we've got maybe 15 years or so of craft whiskey movement, maybe 20 if you really push it. And I think now we're seeing that regionality really come to the fore with designations like Texas whiskey or Empire Rye, things like that. So but having said that, craft whiskey still has that negative connotation for consumers, I think. And I'm curious from your perspective, how long did it take the meaning of craft to be good for beer? And then how long do you think it might take for whiskey to kind of catch up?
So that's an interesting question, and I'm gonna remind everybody, you and me and all the listeners, that when craft beer took off, see, they used to be called microbreweries before they were
Mhm.
called craft. Sometimes they were called artisanal, sometimes they were called boutique, and craft is what ended up sticking. When those small breweries came out, their focus was generally on reproducing either a traditional English ale or a traditional German lager. And
Mhm.
we're trying to make things as good as they tasted when we were visiting those countries and drinking fresh beer. So we didn't want to have the flavors of like struck, bottles and oxidized beers and all sorts of problems with the imports that were, just finally starting to come in the early 80s. What we were up what our competitors were Bud, Miller's, Coors, and small regional American Pilsners. So it was easy to say that craft was different because it focused on flavor. It did not focus on low bittering units, easy drinkability, convenience. It wasn't marketed like no flavor. It was marketed like high flavor. It was marketed like wine. Charles Finkel from Merchant de Vin and then later Pike Brewing was instrumental in getting that message across to Americans that beer can be treated like quality wine instead of like kind of a fizzy pop that had alcohol. I'm thinking our future is. I'm just delighted, by the way, to hear you name very regional, not distillery flavors yet, although you did mention them, but just things like, say, uh, High Mountain or Colorado. I mean, the fact that that is now a named flavor is so cool. It's not just the brand of the hops or the variety of the hops anymore. It's actually the region, a New England IPA, a hazy, or whatever. People know where they come from and where they were generated. California pale ale. What we aspire to, but remembering that whiskey has a long, long curve to mature and finally be ready, is all of those things that brewers have done in faster cycles. So they can do that in 3 weeks to 6 months, depending on the beer variety. We have to do it in years, probably not decades, but definitely years. We're working to discover all of those things that beer has just really recently, in the past 20 years, nailed. What are these varieties of hops and what are these strains of yeast and what type of bacteria? What can we do with a wood program? Are there any inclusions we can do that add new texture, flavors, and aromas? And that's just starting with whiskey. So I kind of feel like we don't know what we're doing yet, and this will take generations to get right. Craft is that exploration of, and I'm going to use this term several times today, a philosophy of flavor. It's not throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. It's that we're targeting a concept and we need to do experiments and controls and carefully think about how flavor is generated and use that knowledge that we're developing, sharing it with each other, conferences, papers, and just neighbors, and learning about how to create flavors. Barley varieties right now are being dictated by bigger brands based on yield, agronomic yield. And that makes a lot of sense. Farmers need to make a living too, right? But I feel like if we find that a very small farm can produce a boutique variety of barley, and that variety of barley, when treated with the right processes, malted correctly, fermented correctly, using the right strain with the right cuts in distillation and put in the right type of barrel and right warehouse conditions, makes a whiskey that is like no other. That's when we've reached the Holy Grail. That's when we've actually created terroir of everything, process, product, and flavor. And that's the goal. That's what we're all hopefully developing right now by sharing information.
That brings up something else you said in that same interview in 2018, that at the time you were still using, as you said, the one yeast strain, the Elysium Brewery's house yeast.
Yep.
So the one strain of yeast, playing around maybe a little bit with barley, but not too much, I think, at the time. And you were very clear that you were not playing with the cuts. Then the cuts you mentioned at that point, I think it was 147 for the heads and 121, I believe, for the tails, 127, something like that. They were set very closely. So it seems to me you're working from a very scientific perspective of control every variable you can and then alter the one that you want to test out. But at the same time, as you said, you're not going in blind. You have an idea that this thing might work. So how do we control the variables to make sure that what we're getting is as close to our hypothesis as possible?
Yeah, you because, as I mentioned before, it is a big data problem. It does have too many variables to be able to attribute to one. So we can, and so it's not science. It is still a craft and an art that we're exploring. So while this is going to be a good segue into you tasting Release 50. So let me tell you the story that we did there. You remember me saying that we use a base malt, and it's always been pale malt. So let me tell you a little bit about what that means. When I was a brewer for all those years, I would buy silos full of pale malt. And the pale malt was where the bulk of the alcohol came from. Depending on what type of product I'd want to make, I would add specialty malts. So there'd be caramel malts of different kiln levels. The darker the kiln, the higher and faster it got dried, the more deeper sugars would form. Caramelization would happen inside the husk. You could roast or toast the malt or even the raw barley and get all these different flavors for porters and stouts and dark ales. But the pale malt, you just bought as a commodity. So even as a brewer, I was not paying attention to terroir, farms, anything. What happened is when Copperworks and when Westland, right down the street from Copperworks, opened, is small malt houses opened. Well, guess what a small malt house gets to do? It gets to keep that individual field or farm's yield separated from all the other barley that are being harvested that day or that week and treat it specifically so that you can taste what came off of that farm. That wasn't something we ever had access to. So all the farms were blended for a standard specification. That was great if your goal was to make a product that never deviated year after year, even though the agriculture was deviating. You didn't want to express that deviation. You wanted everything to taste exactly the same. That works for international and even national sales, but it doesn't really work for craft. And we wanted to explore the variations. So we did have to limit certain things, keeping the yeast strain, keeping the cuts the same, trying to focus on very specific barrel contributions of flavors, keeping the warehouse temperatures the same. Those are things that you don't find in traditional distilleries, like the warehouse conditions being the same. They vary, but we have a heated warehouse or heated warehouses. We'll get to that later.
Yep.
So the whole goal was to keep everything as scientific as we could without really doing science. We aren't running controls and weren't doing enough variations. So what we did with this release number 50 is, you remember that barley that was the Fritz that you just tasted, the pale? This is exactly the same, but instead of having it kilned like we would normally kiln for a pale, we had it kilned a little hotter and a little faster. And that's what would make a Vienna malt. So in traditional German Vienna lagers, they kiln a little bit higher and you get more caramelization, but not a big, nothing like you would get from, the type of caramel 30, 40, 50 lava bonds that you would get if you were making, say, an amber ale. So we were looking for something that would still provide about the same amount of fermentability, but bring more melanoidins, more toasty flavors, more grain flavors forward. The big difference we were trying to do between 49 and 50 was just that slightly higher kiln level. The experiment is still, it's only been repeated that one, or it's only been done that one time. It hasn't been repeated. So I'm very interested in, first of all, what similarities you see and what differences you see between those two.
I can say immediately the first similarity is that both of them just blew out of the glass. So they're, again, not being held back by the alcohol bonds being a little too tight on the flavors. But there's, I mean, just as immediately, you can tell on the Vienna, it is a little bit darker. There is more of a, whereas I said the Fritz was kind of the caramel just turning in the pan. Now we're talking more the taste of a Werther's after you're done sucking on it. That just lingers in the mouth. I think while the proof did not feel higher on the taste, the what I call the prickle was on the entire tongue and really lacquered the tongue from front to back, whereas the Fritz was more mid palate back. And I would say almost the same thing with the finish, that I'm getting more fruity notes. I'm let me take another taste to figure out exactly which fruit. They're definitely more of a stone fruit and a darker flesh stone fruit, to say that. So something with a pit, something definitely not orchard fruit, darker, more intense. There's also a hint of strawberry in here. I kind of like, it's like, what is that at first? And then it came to me, it was strawberry. So the finish is not reaching back as far, I would say, but it's reaching forward more. I'm still feeling it on the upper palate, on like the top of my mouth and the full tongue. So this, I think, revealed more fruit to me than the previous one did. And the last thing I'll say too is that when I smelled and tasted this, the Vienna one, release 50, for better or worse, this one immediately felt to me a little bit more like what you'd think of as maybe a traditional Highland Scotch. Certainly considerably heavier and more intense. But I think that one felt closer to that profile perhaps than the Fritz did for me.
Yeah.
And for me, I enjoyed both, but I'm trying to think as a consumer who's being exposed to the product for the first time, the 50 might almost be more approachable in a sense because it will taste a little more familiar.
That's interesting. Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. When you're doing a conversion from a Scotch drinker to an American single malt whiskey drinker, you have a lot of hurdles. And one of those big hurdles is that Scotch drinkers have invested a lot of their time, money, and identity in learning the history, the flavors, and the stories behind those brands. And so they're a little bit reluctant to just like start over again, throw all that stuff out and say, yeah, it's not Scotch, it's this. And Whereas if you bring, say, a wine drinker, a beer drinker, a cider drinker in, or even a bourbon drinker, they're a little bit less committed to that category.
Mhm.
And I find it's sometimes easier to therefore get a Scotch drinker interested if the product is somewhat Scotch-like. So Virginia Distilling has a really good kind of Highland malt flavor, even though it's made in Virginia. It's designed by Dr. Jim Swain, so he has a lot of that Scotch design in his mind when he was putting that distillery together. So I want to remind you that actually both of these are Fritz. The first one is Fritz Pale, and the second one is Fritz Vienna. And
Yes, I
so
misstated that. Thank you.
that's
Yes.
absolutely fine. So what's
Yeah.
interesting is that we're exploring our Copperworks' first ever darker variety of base malt. Where I'd like to go with this is, so let's talk about why some of the variations happen. When the malt house takes a delivery of barley, all sorts of things can be measured. And some of them are really critical to what that barley can be turned into in the malt house. So, what's its viability? How fast does it sprout and germinate? What sort of enzyme activity does it have? What temperatures? How fast does it absorb water? So, all sorts of things need to be determined in that malt house, the temperature and how long it's in steep and how many steeps. That doesn't then mean that just because we want that variety, or what they call that batch they call a piece, what we want that piece to turn out, it actually may not be the best thing. It might have been better if it had been turned into a pale malt or even a caramel or a roasted barley. We don't know because we're not maltsters. What's great about working with a maltster is that they can read that and say, yeah, this is actually going to be really good if we do treat it this way. We're not at that point yet in brewing and distilling where there's a communication between malt house and brewer, or malt house and distiller. That always goes from well, it kind of goes, the malt house tells the farmer what to grow, or even AMBA or Scotch malt, the Scotch brewing and malt distilling industry tells farmers what to plant. The malt houses buy what was planted. They turn it into what they want to turn it into, and then they tell brewers and distillers what they have. And I think that a much better communication cycle is what's going to lead to a lot more focused design of flavors, where distillers and brewers are saying, I want a flavor like this. Malt houses are going, we can only get that when we receive these types of barley specs. And then working with everything from the local extension agent to the research institute in that region to ensure they're planting the seeds that have the best chance of survival and making those flavors under the conditions that their farm is in. And that's the golden grail, the holy grail. We're working towards that, and we have a long time to go. So this is not an apology, but it is saying that that is the first time that we have ever specified that we wanted a Vienna kiln. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's the only Vienna kiln flavor that we can get. It's just that variety of Fritz grown that year at that malt house with that piece made those flavors. And this is why this is just like, God, this is a generational experiment. Super
Absolutely.
fun. But I'm
Well,
glad you had a chance to taste those two side by side. It's rare that we, Copperworks, produce products that have a very A and B. Again, remembering that a million other little factors come in, but our intent is to provide you A and B. Right now, we have released 47 and 48. We're just about done with, so this is why 49 and 50 are coming out. 47 and 48 are literally the same whiskey, 48 has 7.5% additional whiskey that was aged exclusively in a manzanilla cask. And so you can really tell the difference between, if you take this whiskey and drink it, here's what it tastes like. If you take this whiskey, add 7.5% more whiskey with that manzanilla finish, or not finish, but 5 years of maturation, what does that do to that flavor balance? That was the first time we did that as an apples to apples comparison. So this is another, what we're trying to do as an apples to apples. It's pretty fun.
I love it as a consumer. I do for sure. So as you mentioned, that there is a need for more communication between farmer and maltster, and I think as you could expand that to the entire network, is that farmer, maltster, brewer, distiller, everything needs to be really talking more. I think that's a good time to introduce or remind people that just last year, Skagit Valley malting very abruptly closed. And I think it took a certain level of geekiness or interest in the whiskey industry to know the name. But if you knew the name, you knew its importance. For many of us not on the production side of the industry, I think our immediate reaction was this huge red flag. Oh my God, where are they going to get their malt from? Who's going to do the kind of funkier malts, if you will, that others weren't? But you actually, in that Drammers conversation, you flipped that perspective a bit and said that, yes, of course, it's a shame to lose them. They were a huge player in this game and in that conversation that you want to have between farmers, maltsters, distillers. But at the same time, because they forged that path forward and so many have followed in their wake, it softened the blow because there were still other places you could go to that could handle you saying, okay, we want to do a Vienna malt on this one, as opposed to just the pale malt. And maybe want to add some peat into this. I know that's a much harder sell, but is that so? I guess my first question is, in October, that closure was still pretty raw for the industry. It was very recent. We're maybe about 6 months past it at this point. From your perspective in production and just talking to the people around the scene, how do you feel that brewers and distillers are adapting so far?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'll answer that question and then I'll add a little color to the background. Brewers and distillers were fortunate in our region to have other people step up to the plate. And those other people were people who had already stepped up to the plate and were already beginning to make quality malts locally here in Washington. And other folks who were outside of Washington, but were willing and able to buy Washington barley and malt it and ship it back up to Washington brewers and distillers. So what's happening is the demand is still there. It's not the demand that was paying the bills to keep Skagit Valley malting open, but it is the demand that probably will pay the bills to keep a Skagit Valley malting open in the future as consumers catch up. A lot of early thought leaders don't make it. And they don't make it because they have the right values, they have the right ideas, but it takes a while for the whole consumer base to catch on. Here's some of the color. I remember going into bars and restaurants in Seattle with Pike Place's 1989 new pale ale. And I'd said, we just made a pale ale. It's delicious. You should try it. And I'll pour it in a glass and they say, that's not pale, that's brown, that's amber. Why don't you call that something else? I was like, well, it's named after a traditional British style of beer. Oh, never mind. Let's just taste it. And they taste it and they say, well, what are those? What's that bitter flavor? And so, well, those are hops. And no, I don't taste that in my bud. Well, no, that's because the number of hops that they use, the international bitter units in that beer, below the threshold of taste. This is something that we believe consumers want to taste, not my consumers, right? So it takes a while to get people up to speed. Now, you can't go into any bar or restaurant and not find at least several craft beer taps. It's just everybody has accepted that now. But Skagit Valley was early. They opened about the same week that Westland started its concept and started making American single malt whiskey. That was what Westland was doing, and they were helping Skagit Valley get off the ground by being one of their first and biggest customers. We were one of their biggest customers as well. And the challenge is, how do you ride the wave for years while that whiskey is maturing, markets are learning about it, consumers are buying it, and then finally the demand is there? Well, you're 25 years old now as a company, so you had to figure something out to last that long. And I hate to say it, but they were the thought leaders in that industry, but there just wasn't the money to keep them open for all of that time. And what needed to happen is they showed the opportunity, and now smaller, maybe little, not as well funded, but niche small malt houses are able to survive by offering similar products to those same customers. And we're going to see that grow. And we're going to see more people step into the space, just as more brewers stepped into the space. Malt houses are going to be supplying those brewers. It's a tough industry, right? With brewing shrinking, but craft spirits are growing, and craft whiskey is a big consumer of barley and of course corn and rye. So there's still a big opportunity for a place like a Skagit Valley. They were probably just too early, but not on the wrong track, just too early.
For sure. And again, like I said, sad to lose them. I hope that well, clearly their thought has inspired many others, and I hope that continues that trend.
And their equipment, for the most places, is still in place. The need is has never reduced, meaning the reason that whole idea started was because all those farmers in the Skagit Valley needed to put winter cover crops in, and they were putting winter cover crops in and then tilling them under or selling them for feed. And the question was, can't our farmers do something that's more value add, including things like growing malting quality barley over the winter? And then instead of just plowing that, can they sell the seed and make money off of that, and then plow in the stocks or biomass the stocks? And the answer was yes, but it took a big infrastructure to build that. It's going to continue to grow as we see more acceptance of local whiskeys. But that's taking years, and we're all patiently putting out the products to make sure that people enjoy that.
So with that, shall we open? I'm expecting that the Baroness will be the next one. Save the peat for last.
Yep, let's do the peat is not overpeated, so yeah, let's do the Baroness.
The Baroness, as I'm pouring it, I noted that variety in particular has shown up in several releases from Copperworks, and whereas others you've used Concerto, or I don't think you used Laureate as far as I know, but
we've actually never used Concerto either. Yeah.
Which one am I thinking of? There's one with a C that I'm
Copeland.
I'm sorry. Yes, Copeland. I should be happy with myself that I remember the varietals at all, but I usually should remember that. So, what about the I guess the Baroness and the Copeland strains speak to you, fit your vision, however you want to put it?
So I want to talk a little bit about AMBA, American Malting and Brewing Association. AMBA is a trade organization with the goal of furthering quality barley. The way you get on a deciding board of AMBA is by paying more dues. And the way you pay dues is by how many tons of barley you use a year. So the more you use, the more you pay. That makes sense. If you're going to be dictating what type of product gets planted, you'd want to be, if you're a big user, you'd want to have a bigger voice. So I understand how that happens. What that means is that the really biggest brands who buy barley, Anheuser-Busch, Miller Coors, are the ones that make the most decisions about what type of barley is chosen. What are their goals? Flavor is not their goal. Yield is their goal. They want everybody in the value chain to get the maximum amount of yield. The farmers need to be able to do very large acreage, 5,000, 50,000 acres. They need to be able to bring in that price the low as possible per ton, but the quality goes up. And so the way you do that is you involve research institutes, and they're targeting all the things that reduce yield agronomically, et cetera. Flavor is not part of the story. As a matter of fact, if it has too much flavor, it will fail the early tests and it won't be grown to volume. So AMBA is in an interesting point now because they still have those big decision makers, but they now have a lot of small people. I'm on a communications committee for AMBA. And one of the interesting things is AMBA wants to and plans to be a voice for all craft beer and whiskey makers, not just the big guys. So we have to have another way of picking grain. Right now, what Copperworks gets to do is we get to decide what farm and what variety, what farm and what malt conditions. So, like the pale versus the Vienna. But we don't get yet to tell the farmers what to grow. That's something that's just starting, where we can say, can you grow this variety of barley? Because we think that we'd like to express that flavor. Alba is a good example of a variety that we really liked. So where do these varieties come from first? You mentioned Concerto, but Copeland, Genie, several of these are AMBA selected malts, or they were AMBA selected malts. Nowadays, AMBA's moved on. They found another barley that's even shows more promise. When those varieties get grown, what we get to do is find out what their expression is. What do they taste like? But we're still not telling the farmers what to plant. Or, the research institutes what to design for, what to focus on. Where I find interest is in Baroness. Baroness, 35 years ago, was designed for, it's a 6-row malt, it's not a 2-row malt. It was designed for a German lager production. And it didn't win favor. I'm not sure why, but its patent was sold to another company, and eventually the patent for that was sold to Monsanto. And that patent prevents anybody from growing that grain and then selling the seed for seed stock. They can malt it and sell the malt. They just can't grow the grain. So eventually Monsanto killed that. They just weren't producing any seed stock anymore and nobody could buy it. But a bunch of farmers around America and Germany had been buying that seed and planting it and saving their own seeds to replant, mainly for animal feed, sometimes just for biomass, never for barley, malting in beer and spirits. Bill Myers in Colfax, Washington on Joseph's Granary has been running that in his fields for 35 years and decided that he was going to try to get it malted for beer. He's one of the only people that I'm aware of that has decided to try to get that malted as beer. And we thought that was delightful and such an interesting idea that every year we help support Bill's vision of growing that variety in Colfax, Washington, and seeing how it changes over the years, and supporting the fact that he is having to create his own seed stock. He can't sell the seed to anybody. So he's becoming one of fewer and fewer farmers who even have access to Baroness malt. And it's a delicious malt. It has certain types of fruit notes that no other malt that we're aware of has. When it comes off of his farm, we've never tasted it from another farm because, as far as we know, there's nobody else doing it to get that malted. So this has just been a really fun learning experience, and that's why we do it every year. Bill holds a festival he calls Baroness Days. It's in August, usually the second week in August. And that has about, I don't know, 200 or 300 brewers and distillers show up over in Colfax, Washington, camp out. He pulls stage up and hires some bands and has barbecues. And it's just a fun, you get to ride the combine and, help harvest. So it's a pretty neat thing. And we're proud to have that happening in Washington State. So we're always going to make a Baroness.
I'm very glad you will. It's real. It is different. And I've been fortunate to be able to try, I referenced Waterford earlier, being able to try these different strains, again, controlling the other variables. So tasting a farm to farm or a strain to strain. And whereas the two Fritz malts, the pale and the Vienna, you could tell the through line as we discussed. This one was in a, no pun intended, a totally different field. And at first on the nose, you could tell it was a little bit subtler than the Fritz was. Still, I would almost put it, because the Fritz was so strong out of the glass, I would say this is more like a normal level nose. And smelled sweet, almost chocolatey, kind of a semi-sweet chocolate. The Ghirardelli squares that have the caramel in the center.
Mm-hmm.
So towards the darker side rather than the sweeter side. Then you taste it, and immediately I got grapefruit and tons of citrus and citrus with the pith. What do you think is important?
Yep.
And my mind went to things like for brands that people might know immediately, like Shock Top, Blue Moon, these Belgian white styles of beer that are so light and summery in their flavor, with a nice sweet, sour, bitter combination at the same time. So that's the first wave of flavor. The second wave hits, and that brings out more of the chocolate again, closer to the nose.
Yeah.
So that disconnect from the initial tasting gets rounded out. So you still taste the grapefruit and the pith, but there's more darkness, shall we say, to it.
Mm-hmm.
Huge mouthfeel.
Cool.
Less proof forward, even though it's 10 plus percent ABV higher than the Fritz were. I think it drinks lower for me, and almost closer to where the Fritz is. I think it drinks closer to about 100 proof rather than 120 plus.
Yeah.
Not a lot of static on the tongue, shall we say, but just heaps of flavor and really laying it on. We're talking thick lacquer, not that thin little layer on. So that was my impression of it. The finish too, mainly in the mouth, not so much in the throat, but I'm okay with that because it means it's less burn and more upfront flavor.
That's all very interesting, and I agree, especially the pith. We get a lot of orange pith and melon rind type of flavors out of that. And I misspoke. I said that was a 6-row variety. It's not. It's a 2-row variety, but they're not as plump. They're not as plump kernels as most some of the more modern 2-rows are. But and the reason I said 6-row, the reason I was thinking about that is because of the amount of husk character that comes out of Baroness is greater than the amount that you would get from a big fat plump modern kernel. And that leads to some of those tannins, but also to some of those flavors, like you talked about, the pith, the bitterness, the sourness. It's actually a flavor profile from the barley, which I think is delightful that we can taste that. If you made a beer from it, you probably would be able to tell the difference, but you might ascribe it to being a byproduct of a yeast or a byproduct of a hop bittering, some alpha acid. Whereas here we know that that's not the case, so it has to be more the barley. If we hadn't done it for the past 7 years, I would say there's the verdict's not out that that's where that flavor is coming from. but we have, and we do know that that's a repeatable flavor. So this is the beginning. We also were doing some experiments with genie year after year from certain farms, particularly salmon safe certified farms. And that's giving us the opportunity to see how there is a consistent flavor. The variations are from what? Are they from the location of the farm? Possibly. Are they from the conditions of the harvest or the growth and harvest? Probably. And then, of course, very much the conditions of the malt house and how that particular grain expressed itself uh, through fermentation, distillation, and maturation. So, but the Baroness is you nailed some of the key factors in there. Is, and of course this one is a higher proof because this is a cask strength. Is that that citrus and that pithiness there? I think that's really great that you picked that up.
So to get these flavors, not only coming from the yeast, from the fermentation, but also making it through the distillation, is, I want to say, difficult as a broad term, that some flavors just do not translate. And some, as you mentioned earlier, some sugars don't make it through. And when you're talking about the maltodextrose and the maltriose, those do make it through. And I think you said you were surprised that they made it through when you first did it. So I think that leads me to a question about the stills. Mm-hmm. So you said you're using those fourth size stills for the reason they're
from behind me there. There's the
exactly. Yeah. So, stills that are known for making high quality malt. Mm-hmm. And when you were building Copperworks, both literally and metaphorically, when you were building Copperworks, bought the fourth size stills, and you flew their own, I think, engineer over to install it, train you on it, and tweak it. And I think that process in itself is telling, because you want the best person teaching you, which makes perfect sense. But you said it in one interview that the engineer had to make some alterations to it simply because you're running, a 9% beer with lots of residual sugars. So from a still perspective, what were those alterations that had to be changed?
Yeah, there was a variety of alterations. Some of them were just because of the physical shape of our building. So there's a device called a seal pot, SEALPOT. It's a old school vacuum pressure breaker. It's a way to relieve pressure and vacuum from a still. And the worst case scenarios, you've turned on the still and you've closed all exit ports and pressure's building up. In a modern world, you have a vacuum breaker and a pressure relief valve in one. But in the old school, you have this device that's filled with water, and it can bubble out product vapor through that water, kind of like a P-trap. Or if it is under a vacuum, so you've sealed it all up and it's cooling down and it's sucking a vacuum, instead of collapsing the tank, it can suck air back through that P-trap, that seal pot. Well, one of our locations for the matter of fact, the Balvenie designed spirit still, the seal pot wouldn't fit because we had a 4-inch sprinkler pipe going through the room. And so he had to quickly engineer and have manufactured over in Scotland and sent overnight a breaker for that. When it came to what they try to do is what's called a balanced distillery, so that your beer stripping still is bigger than your spirit still, so that you collect the right amount of heads, hearts, and tails, and you always have the heads and tails going back into the next batch as part of the charge. They anticipate a higher yield because they anticipate more alcohol from fermentation. So when they engineer these stills and the design of them, they anticipated a lower volume of heads and tails. But we have a higher volume of heads and tails because we're making narrow cuts and we're making less alcohol in that fermentation. So it really wasn't anything that we had to engineer the stills on. What we had to do is we had to decide what to do when we collect excess heads and tails. And we took a page out of the rum industry when they create a batch of rum that has no low lines involved. It's just heads and tails. They still make the heads, hearts, and tails cuts when they make this batch, but the entire spirit still charge is from previous batches, heads and tails. So we do that. We use the name that they use, which is Queen's Run. And so we will maybe 2 or 3 times a year have enough of those heads and tails to run a Queen's Run. And that's unusual. Scotch distilleries generally don't get that. Irish, Japanese distilleries generally don't get that. So that's been something that we just had to design how to do. You know, we also had installed a 25 plate, 13-inch diameter column still. Neil Bogue is the engineer who designed that. And he designed it from scratch, from a blank piece of paper. He didn't take another successful column still they had made and just, squish it down by 50% or something. He started with the engineering white piece of paper and was delighted that it was so efficient and so good. He was literally hopping up and down, calling his manager in Scotland and getting him out of bed to tell him that this was just, hitting 191.5 proof. Just blew him away at how good it was running. So we've been really excited to have the traditional distillery stills manufactured by a traditional distillery still maker, but run on new types of whiskey base. This beer that we're putting in is not something that's normally being done. So that's new to them, and we couldn't be happier with the stills.
And so in our last 10 minutes or so, there are 2 things I'm going to hit. The peat, which is our last one to taste, and also some of the things from the business side.
Sure.
So while I pour the peat into my glass, I wanted to just ask for kind of an update on where you are. So going off of your, this was the second One Nation Under Whiskey interview. This was in September of 21. So a year and a half into the COVID pandemic. Due to it, you lost about 80% of the retail of your retail market. Things were closed. You had been able to make up some of it from either direct to consumer or otherwise shipping and more bottle sales. But obviously an 80% loss is an 80% loss. I'm just curious, 2+ years later, 2.5 years later, almost, have things rebounded for you in that space, and how are things looking from that market?
Yes, but not to pre-2019 numbers. As a matter of fact, it's almost like having started over again. Let's talk just real briefly about that. Whiskey in particular, I'm generally gonna just leave vodka and gin out of the conversation, even though they also have the same sort of trends. But whiskey in general was on a pretty steep uphill climb and doing really well every year. The challenge with whiskey was you just didn't have enough. You were selling the whiskey today that you made 4 years ago, not the whiskey that you made last week. So you had to be also putting up whiskey at that volume to be able to sell 4 times the amount of whiskey in 4 years that you're selling today. That's just capital infusion. You can't do that on cash flow. When COVID came, and actually it maybe even took us about a year into COVID to really think through this. It didn't look like we were just going to bounce right back to day one, just where we left off. Like, you close the door, but when you open the door and you step back through, you're right where you were before. People's behavior had changed, and people were drinking more at home and less in the bars and restaurants, and they were drinking, at first drinking more, and then drinking bottom shelf, and then drinking less. So we're aware of two things, and we made some decisions about 3 years ago. Not only are we going to be focused more on direct to consumer, but we're going to do that through our own tasting rooms. And what that allows us to do is to really control the narrative, control the margins. We don't have to have all of that whiskey aged and selling it at wholesale prices around the world. We can have a lot of that whiskey selling directly to our neighborhoods and regions at the highest margins for us and the best experience for us to share the story with the customers and them to understand who we are and what we do. So think about the brew pub bottle, except for it's stuff that we made multiple years ago instead of 3 weeks ago. We start over again by going back to the bars and restaurants and reintroducing them to craft whiskey. Almost every bar and restaurant suffered unduly, and people still aren't eating out in the ways that they did before. Especially in our region, the cost of labor has gone up so much that restaurants are finding it very difficult to be competitive. So they've gone back to the international big brands that that you would find in any airport restaurant. And so we have to go back in and sell them on why is this product, which is produced 5 blocks away, competitive, and why would your consumers care? And so this is also part of why it helps for us to be able to sell and tell the consumers directly through our tasting rooms what we have to offer, so that when they do go into a restaurant that doesn't have us, they can say, how come you don't have them? They're local and I love them and I've been drinking them at their facility and I'd like to have that here. And so that they become our brand ambassadors. Well, we made some decisions right when COVID started, and we've been doing them ever since, that we're going to not only involve the consumers in that level of conversation, but we're actually going to invite them to become investors and become our brand ambassadors. We now have 1,800 co-owners of Copperworks, and we'll be doing another release to do even more. And what that allows us to do is to really get engaged with these consumers who care about us, care about our philosophy, care about their region, care about their farming community, care about a food movement, and help us stay solvent and continue to tell this story and to create these products. And they help us get those accounts. They go into the bars, restaurants, grocery stores, and liquor stores and sing the praises of the company that they now own. And that's a new philosophy of and frankly, a new avenue that wasn't legal in 2016 of ways to get the community to support your brand, not just by buying your brand and telling each other that they like it, but actually owning part of your brand. That's not for everybody. Not everybody wants to be helping manage a shareholder army, but for those of us who do, it's a really fun opportunity. And I have to say, it's been one of the pleasures of this distillery for the past 5 years is having that many people behind us.
It's fantastic to hear, and clearly you're still going, which is the most important thing. So I know we just have a couple minutes left. I do want to talk about this peated, the peated Copeland. From the nose, I wouldn't even know it was peated. It's very subtle, and on there's something there. You can tell. I would almost think it's if I knew, like if I was in Seattle and I were going to the tasting room, I would look. If I knew my geography well enough, I think I would look out the window toward Elliott Bay and think, oh, that flavor is probably because they're near a saltwater bay. So there's just the tiniest bit of salinity that you would get from some of the scotches that you get on the coast, on the West Coast in particular, and Campbelltown and all of them. A little bit of salinity, some maritime notes, but even on the palate, the peatiness that you would think of is just not there. Mm-hmm. It's more like a smoked fruit, like when you grill a plum or a pineapple, and it's absolutely none of the kind of iodine-y what I think of as the extremes of peat sometimes. And this could be a whole nother episode on the terroir of peat. And I would love to do that sometime as a roundtable, because it fascinates me. But I guess it just is so different. This is the way I'll put it. And I think this will be the easiest way to describe it. I have a friend who is very into American whiskeys, likes American single malts as well, hates peat, absolutely hates it. I've tried many different types, hates it. I think he might like this because there's a really strong malt flavor in here. It's not the type of whiskey where the peat overtakes, the smoke overtakes any part of it. The malt is still the star. And I think that in itself bounces the peat enough so you just get that little bit of salinity, that hit of maybe a little seaweed, but the fresh seaweed, not in a seaweed salad, not the dried seaweed that's concentrated down into those iodine flavors. So I think that's the best way I would describe it. I wish I were more articulate at this point on them, but I also want to get you out of here on time. But
Well, here's an interesting. You didn't talk about the finish. My expression is the finish. That's where I think you get the most smoke. Let me see if you in your second drink, if you notice.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. That's really where it hits. It's like I said, it's definitely not on the nose, the palate, it's very subtle. But as it hits the back of your tongue, that's where the smoke starts to come out a little bit.
Yeah, and retronasal, right after you exhaled, swallowed, that's suddenly it's like, oh, that's a long smoky finish. The smoke is more like a campfire, like a driftwood beach fire, than it is like a big, phenolic bomb, which is totally unpredictable, right? We had no idea what Washington peat would taste like because how would we? It hasn't been done. Right. Westland was the one that discovered and worked with Skagit Valley Malting to make that peat, that barley. I think that first year was Copeland, to make that a possibility. Because the fact that we are aging our whiskeys the first time in new oak, and then we'll use those barrels again and age whiskey, brand new whiskey in there, in used casks that we've created. Whereas Westland was putting their new make whiskey into used bourbon cask and used sherry casks, they had to wait longer. So even though we started in the same week making that product, ours needed to be released sooner. And we weren't going to release it until Westland released theirs. But when COVID came around, we needed the money, and we told them we're sorry, but we're going to have to release it now. And they're like, go for it. Don't fold, just trying to save that story. So when we discovered how light the peat is, it was perfect. It did exactly what we wanted. It added a nuance of flavor without being the only dominant flavor, and everything else was wiped out. We still kept the flavors of the barley. You can still tell that it's made from a beer rather than a bone dry wash. And yet it has this other intriguing thing that most Scotch drinkers will appreciate. People who like Ireland, who like some peated malts, will appreciate that it's not replacing a Lafroig, a Lagavulin, an Oban, or anything like that. But it does have a unique smokiness to it. But all those people who think they don't like Scotch because Scotch is always tasting like a Band-Aid are going to be new converts that might say, well, that's not so bad. It begs the question, of course, now that Skagit Valley Malting and their particular type of drum roasting or kiln machines are not being used right now, what's going to happen to the future of peat? Both Westland and Copperworks have put up many, many barrels of peated barley as whiskey. So we're both happy that we have a future of 5, 6, 10 years of being able to release this whiskey. During the next 2 or 3 years, we have no question in our minds that somebody, somehow, somewhere in our Washington region will solve the problem of a peated or a smoked malt of some sort. And it doesn't have to just be peat. Peat, as a matter of fact, is not the most environmental thing to make, to use. It is kind of one of the dumbest ideas in the world. If you can really think about it, you're taking a perfectly structured bunch of carbon and you're burning it. The one thing you don't want to do is what you're doing with it. So maybe a better thing to do would be to work with the apple and cherry industry here. And as they pull out trees and burn that wood in scrap piles, maybe we can get that, pelletize it, and use that wood as our local smoke flavor. And I'm fine if peat has its day in the sun and is gone, if that's what is the best thing to do. It doesn't make sense to force it. And we're certainly not going to go buy peat from Scotland. That just, the food miles with that are ridiculous, and that's already been done. So we'll just see what happens. Yeah.
Well, Jason, thank you so much for taking the time today, talking through this. I'm going to, of course, follow up with you. I've got plenty of questions and stats that I want to make sure are correct before I write anything. But just in the meantime, I really appreciate you coming on, letting me taste some of these releases that are coming up. I will make sure to have tasting notes and stats all about that as this episode goes live. So once the new releases go up, people can see what they taste, or what I think they taste like at least, and listen to this and hear what you think they taste like as well. And I think we were pretty in sync. So that makes me feel better. So
I really appreciate the opportunity. It's always fun having people of your level of knowledge and experience to talk with, because as you can imagine, a lot of my day is in talking to brand new whiskey drinkers or people who don't fully understand the process. So thank you for inviting me on the show.
My big goal, make it as valuable time as to you as it is to me. So cheers, Jason. And with that, that's another episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. See y'all next week. Hey folks, thanks for listening to another episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. If you like what you hear, please go ahead and click that subscribe, follow, or like button. Leave a rating and review on your podcast app of choice, and let me know what you want to hear. You can reach out to me through the podcast apps or email me at david@whiskeymyweddingring.com with any suggestions or ideas for new show guests. You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/whiskeymyweddingring. That's whiskey with an E, for as little as $1 a month. $5 a month gets you access to bonus content, including our soon-to-resume Under the Influencer series, and $25 a month means you join the Barrel Share Club. Each month, Barrel Share Club members get to try products sent to me for review, bottles from my own collection, and sometimes bottles that I just pick up because they're fun or interesting. Right now, only 5 spots remain in the Barrel Share Club, so grab your place today. Finally, please follow on Instagram. You can follow me at Whiskey My Wedding Ring or at Whiskey Ring Podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Whiskey Ring. You can follow on Facebook at Whiskey My Wedding Ring or join the Facebook group, the Whiskey Ringers Group. And I hope to see you there. Cheers, thank you for the support, and see you next time.